Like we've got everyone. Mr. Riggs, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Cox. I'm seeing everyone.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor, we're ready to proceed.
We're ready to.
All right, we'll go back on the record then. And Mr. Patterson, you can resume your cross-examination of Ms. Ferris. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Ferris, it is your opinion that every action taken by the General Assembly during the 2018 reconvened regular session was aberrational, correct?
Yes, they share the same characteristic of having taken place in the unprecedented session.
SB 824's sponsor objected to a third reading of SB 824 on the same day as the second reading, correct?
Yes,
SB 824 therefore could have passed on an even more expedited timeline than it did, while still complying with all procedural rules, correct?
it could have passed on a more expedited schedule, but yes, it could. As I said, a lot of the rules were suspended, but yes, it could have had second and third reading in the Senate on the same day.
Okay, I'd like to bring up PDX 3, which was the demonstrative that was used during your testimony. And let's go to the first page of this, or the next page, I guess. Okay, if we could make this a little bigger, I think we could see it on the screen better. Okay, and this is the chart that you discussed during your testimony, correct?
Yes,
And the first shaded date in blue is November 27th, correct?
yes, that's the beginning of the session.
Okay, and is that date also the date that SB 824 was introduced in the Senate?
Yes, filed and introduced.
In your experience, are draft bills ever circulated before formal filing and introduction in the General Assembly?
By circulated, does that mean circulated to other members, circulated to the public, just circulated to anyone?
Circulated to other members.
Yes.
Okay, I would like to bring up JX 772, which is from the transcript of the second reading of SB 824 on the Senate floor. And I believe this is already in evidence. Okay, and let's go to page 3. All right, and let's blow up page 3 here. And actually, let's just scroll up to page 2. I think we'd like to start on page 2. I'm sorry, page 2 of the transcript numbering. There we go. Okay, and I'd like to look at line 12. And at line 12, Senator Kravic begins speaking, correct?
Yes.
Okay, now let's look down to page 3 at line 4, which is still Senator Kravic. Okay, and she says in that beginning where that highlighted language is, "We've been very transparent in this process. We have released the draft last week, and we've talked with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. We've taken input from them. We've had joint legislative oversight committee as well as elections committee and rules committee that have heard this bill. And we've taken all of the input from all of these sources, and we've made 24 changes since the bill was first introduced." Correct?
That's correct, that's what it says.
Okay. And if we look back at your the calendar in your demonstrative, Senator Krovic said the draft bill was released last week. So that means that members of the General Assembly of the Democratic Party had a draft of SB 824 during the week of November 19th, correct?
I don't know what that means. I don't know what she meant by release the draft.
Okay. Your Honors, I would like to publish, and before, let's wait to publish this one until we've had some discussion. JX 758. This is one of the legislative privilege emails, but we are willing to publish this publicly. So there is no need to, close the courtroom or go to a separate session, if that is okay with Your Honors.
So to the extent that you have a legislative privilege, you're waiving that legislative privilege.
Yes, for this particular document.
All right. Does anyone else wish to be heard about this before he publishes the exhibit?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, so if we can publish JX 758. Okay, and let's go to the next page and blow this up so we can read it. Okay, and if we go to the top, keep scrolling up. Okay, so this is on the letterhead of the North Carolina General Assembly, dated November 20th, 2018, correct?
Yes, that's what it says.
And it's addressed to the Honorable Dan Blue and the Honorable Darren Jackson, correct?
Yes.
And these are Democratic members of the General Assembly, correct?
Yes, and I think they were probably the minority leader in the House and the Senate at the time.
Okay, and so if we scroll down to see the text, says, Dear Senator Blue and Representative Jackson, with the passage of the constitutional amendment instituting a voter identification requirement in the North Carolina Constitution, we anticipate that implementing legislation will be filed during the legislative session scheduled to begin on November 27th. Please find attached an initial bill draft for implementing legislation. So this correspondence indicates that the Republican majority shared a draft of what became SB 824 with the opposing Democratic Party on November 20th, correct?
Yeah, it shows that she sent a copy to Senator Blue and Representative Jackson.
Right, and presumably Senator Blue and Representative Jackson shared this with other members of the Democratic Party, correct?
I don't know, but presumably.
Would it be normal legislative practice for leaders of a party to share a draft of a bill with other members of their party?
Yes.
Okay. Do you recall in the exchange or in the statement we read from Senator Krovic that she said there had been 24 changes made to the bill from when it was first introduced?
Yes.
And those 24 changes are in addition to the amendments that were adopted on the House and Senate floor. Is that correct?
I've lost track of when these statements are made. Is she making these statements before the consideration of the bill on the floor?
She's making these at the beginning of second reading in the Senate.
Okay, so when it came out of the Senate committees.
Yes.
Right, so at that point, she's saying there have been 24 changes.
And that was before the additional amendments that were then adopted on the Senate and House floors, correct?
They would have been because she's making the statement at the beginning of second reading.
Okay, great. Governor Cooper's veto of SB 824 was the first time that legislation implementing a constitutional amendment in North Carolina was vetoed, correct?
Yes,
And it is not the general practice of governors of North Carolina to veto bills implementing constitutional amendments, correct?
yes.
So Governor Cooper's veto of SB 824 was aberrational, correct?
It did not follow the historic practice.
So it was aberrational, is that right?
Well, I think you used the word aberrational in a different meaning than I had, as aberrational is not in accord with the historical legislative practice. So,
Well, Governor Cooper's veto was not in accord with historic gubernatorial practice, correct?
right.
Is there any way in which the lame duck General Assembly could have passed legislation implementing the voter ID constitutional amendment after the November election and before January 1, 2019, that would not have been aberrational?
I don't think so, given that practically all of them are enacted in long sessions, and for all the factors that I've seen, that for all the factors that we've discussed, action on this after a general election was unusual or unprecedented.
Okay, let's go to paragraph 27 of your report, if we could bring that back up. You could zoom one more time on that. Okay, great. Net says enactment of a photo identification requirement for voters has been a goal of the Republican leadership at the General Assembly for many years, correct?
Yes,
And as we've discussed, the Republicans were set to lose their veto-proof majority in the General Assembly on January 1st, 2019, correct?
yes,
And the governorship would continue to be held by a Democrat after that date, correct?
yes,
So the only way the Republicans could ensure their ability to enact a voter ID law over a potential veto was to enact it before January 1st, 2019, correct?
yes. But they could have done it in the long session or the short session. They didn't have to wait until after the election to do that. They had their supermajority the whole time.
Right, but I'm saying starting from after the election.
Right, if you haven't
At
done it
that
up until
point.
then. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm just saying at that point, their only option to do it and be able to override a veto would be to do it before January 1st, 2019, correct?
Right, if you've waited that long, that's the last window.
Do you have any reason to believe that the Democrats would have done anything differently had they been presented with the opportunity to ensure enactment of a long-standing legislative goal in a lame duck session before losing a veto-proof majority with a Republican holding the governorship?
Your Honor, objection. This is out of the scope of her report. I'm happy to elaborate on that briefly.
All right, give me just 1 second. All right, the objection's overruled. You may answer the question.
Well, if you've waited until every other opportunity has passed, then and the legislature still wants to make that change, their choice is to have a session after the election. I mean, that's just
Right.
logical. That's the only time that's left. But I
Right,
can't
so-
speak about what their strategy would be, but that's the logical outcome.
And you have no reason to believe the Democrats would not take advantage and pursue that logical outcome were they presented with the same scenario, correct?
I think that's speculation about who wants to press an advantage.
You have not studied the behavior of legislatures when presented with the opportunity to fulfill a long-standing legislative goal in a lame duck session before losing a veto-proof majority when the governorship is held by the opposing party, correct?
That's correct. I've indicated, earlier that I have not studied practices in other states or Congress.
As part of your law practice, you counsel clients on strategies for achieving legislative goals, correct?
Occasionally.
If a hypothetical client came to you on the day after an election, losing a veto-proof majority, and they said, there are important things we want to accomplish, you would advise them that one option would be to call themselves back into session and enact what they are trying to enact, correct?
Objection, Your Honor. This is beyond the scope of her report.
Overruled.
First, let me clarify, when advising a client, the client would have to persuade members of the General Assembly to do something before anything was going to happen. But it's, as I just said, a logical option is having the General Assembly reconvene in a session after the election.
So you would explain that option to your client, correct? And this hypothetical client.
Yes.
And for this hypothetical client, if they came to you and said, we want to ensure we can act regardless of the governor's veto, you would have to advise them that their only option would be to come back in a lame duck session and enact legislation for which they could override the governor's veto before losing their veto-proof majority, correct?
Yes, but that question assumes, as you said, that I was not asked that question until the day after the election, because with clients, I take a long-term view and would have advised action differently so that it didn't have to be done so that was not your only choice left, was the lame duck session.
You think it's puzzling that the General Assembly proposed a voter ID constitutional amendment rather than simply passing a voter ID law, correct?
Yes. I'm puzzled because they had passed voter ID laws twice without first proposing a constitutional amendment.
So they had the authority to enact a voter ID law without proposing a constitutional amendment, correct?
Yes, and they had done it twice before. And in my thinking, it's not a good idea to amend the North Carolina Constitution unless the amendment is required to be able to implement the legislation that you seek.
Does the fact that the General Assembly proposed a constitutional amendment when they did not have to, and then waited to enact legislation until that amendment passed, indicate that the General Assembly wanted to ensure that they were acting consistent with the will of the people in enacting a voter ID bill?
I don't think so. They could have gotten a lot more indication of whether they were acting consistently with the will of the people if they had also proposed or implementing legislation, and they could have gotten responses before the election on that. That legislation would simply have been conditional. So I don't think that conclusions about I don't think that the conclusion you suggest can be drawn from that.
Plaintiffs in this case are not challenging the constitutional amendment that requires voter ID, correct?
That's correct.
For purposes of this case, that amendment is the supreme law of the state, correct?
Obviously.
Even so, your report looks at the enactment of HB 1092, which proposed the constitutional amendment to the voters, correct?
Yes, it did. And the reason I did that is because that's the first step. If you don't have language implementing a constitutional amendment unless it's preceded by the amendment itself. So I went back to see, well, why were we how did this amendment get on the ballot? Why was this implementing legislation not done until after the short session? And so when I look back, I think that House Bill 1092 and Senate Bill 824 are necessarily kind of tied together. And my conclusion was that from beginning to end, that process was not in accordance with the historical legislative practices.
Okay, let's turn to paragraph 71 of your report.
Okay.
Okay, and you have discussed this already today, but it says until 2018, when the text of a proposed constitutional amendment to the 1971 Constitution required the General Assembly to enact laws on the topic of the amendment, the General Assembly enacted the proposed amendment and the implementing laws in the same session and sometimes in the same bill, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so let's go to the charts at the top of page 24 of your report. So that's page 24 on the bottom, yeah, the internal pagination. Okay, and so these are the instances in which the General Assembly, the first two entries are the instances in which the General Assembly enacted implementing legislation at the same time or in the same session as the amendment. Is that correct?
Well, these are the instances in which the amendment text requires the General Assembly to take action. It's not a list of all of the amendments for which implementing laws were enacted in the same bill or the same session.
Well, these are the only.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. No, I'm saying these are the only instances in which the amendment text required implementing legislation. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay. And so there were only two amendments in North Carolina history before the voter ID amendment in which implementing legislation was required. Is that right?
Right. Based on this chart.
And this
And
is
they
a
were in
chart that,
1971.
yes. And so the General Assembly had not faced this scenario for 47 years by 2018. Is that correct?
That amount of time had elapsed.
And the constitutional amendment proposing voter ID was not the only constitutional amendment proposed in 2018 that required implementing legislation, correct?
That's correct.
The General Assembly did not pass implementing legislation at the same time as the Marcy, let me back up. That other amendment was the Marcy's Law Amendment, is that correct?
Yes.
And the General Assembly did not pass implementing legislation at the same time as the Marcy's Law Amendment was proposed, correct?
Right.
So now in North Carolina's history, the General Assembly has for two amendments requiring implementing legislation, passed that legislation in the same session. And for two other amendments, it is not, correct?
Well, now I think we're mixing up two things. One is whether it about implementing legislation, and the other is about whether or not the ballot indicates that the General Assembly has a necessary role. As far as having implementing legislation enacted, it was very typical to do that, even when it was authorized as well as required. But for the actual requirements, this is the chart. So anyway, I thought we were starting to confuse the two, but please ask your question again.
Okay, I'm sorry, and I apologize if it was not clear. The question was, so that now in North Carolina history, there have been 4 proposed constitutional amendments that required implementing legislation. For 2 of those, the General Assembly has passed implementing legislation in the same session as the proposed amendment, and for 2 of them, it has not. Is that correct?
Right, and what this chart was showing that until the 2018 session, that's what happened. But yes, you're right.
Okay. And was Marcy's law controversial?
I don't think so. I didn't follow that, so I don't think it was. It again was an unnecessary constitutional amendment. The General Assembly can provide crime victims with rights as they choose. So I don't think it was controversial, but I did not follow that one closely.
Okay. And was there any threat that the governor would veto the implementing legislation for Marcy's law?
I don't know for certain, but like I say, I don't think it was controversial, so it makes me think that the governor would not likely veto the bill.
Okay. And you have discussed how the ballot language did not have in it that the General Assembly was required to pass implementing legislation, correct?
Yes,
The full text of the amendment, along with an official explanation, was included in the Judicial Voter Guide sent to the address of every registered voter in the state, correct?
yes.
And you have done nothing to study the extent to which voters in North Carolina understood the effect of the proposed voter ID amendment, correct?
I haven't made a study. I know from questions that my friends and family asked me what different notions that people had about the bill, but no, I have not done a study of what people in North Carolina thought about the amendment.
Okay. You discussed in your direct testimony the Fourth Circuit's decision overturning the preliminary injunction in the parallel federal court litigation. Is that correct?
Yes,
That decision was released before you submitted your expert report, correct?
yes.
And you did not discuss that decision or even acknowledge it in your report, correct?
Correct.
If I could have a moment to look at my notes here, I think those are all the questions that I have. Thank you, Ms. Ferris.
All right, Mr. Cox, will you be doing the cross-examination on behalf of the state defendants?
Yes, Your Honor, and I have no questions. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Klein, do you have any redirect questions?
I do briefly, Your Honor.
All right, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Ferris, you were asked by Mr. Patterson about the 2018 lame duck session and whether the legislature had ever held lame duck sessions before. I'd like to ask you about whether there is any distinction in the lame duck session held in 2018 to the other lame duck sessions that you were discussing earlier.
The legislature had never held a regular reconvene session after an election. In fact, it had never held a regular reconvene session after the short session. Up until 2018, the short session ended the regular sessions. So the lame duck sessions that had been held were extra sessions called by either the governor or by the written request of the legislators.
You were also asked about whether holding a lame duck session before an impending power shift was appropriate. Ms. Ferris, after the Democrats, are you aware that the Democrats lost control of the North Carolina General Assembly in November 2010?
Yes.
And do you recall if after the Democrats lost control of the General Assembly in November 2010, whether they came back for any sort of lame duck session?
I was at on the legislative staff at the time, and there was no lame duck session.
And do you recall if at that time they attempted to enact any law seeking to entrench or press for political advantage during the lame duck session?
Well, if they didn't have a lame duck session, they wouldn't have had any kind of laws in that session.
I'd like to pull up the demonstrative that was discussed by Mr. Patterson. That is a PDX 3-2. Ms. Fairs, can you describe why in your mind it's accurate to start highlighting of dates in this on the 27th of November?
The dates are highlighted starting on the 27th because that's when the General Assembly convened. It's the first day of the reconvened session.
Why is that significant in your mind?
It's the day the session started. It's the day that official action starts during the session. It's the day that bills are filed to be considered. Start to be filed.
Thank you. During your questioning by Mr. Patterson, you were shown another exhibit, I believe JX 758, if I'm recalling that correctly. And I'd like to pull that up. Were you shown this document in your deposition in this matter, Ms. Ferris?
No, I was not.
Are you aware that this document was produced after expert discovery in this matter had already concluded?
No, I had no knowledge that this document existed, so I don't know anything about this document.
Thank you. You were asked, we can take this down, thank you. You were asked about the political situation present in the North Carolina General Assembly by Mr. Patterson. In your mind and experience, do politically unique situations mean that prior standard legislative practices no longer exist?
No, it doesn't mean that they no longer exist because the facts establish what the prior legislative practices have been.
Thank you. I have no further. Sorry.
Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Ms. Ferris. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Patterson, do you have any recross?
I think I have two questions with Your Honor's indulgence.
All right.
Ms. Ferris, in your redirect just now, you discussed the distinction between a reconvened regular session and a extra session called by legislative request. Is there any substantive distinction in the authority of what the General Assembly can do in those different types of sessions?
No.
And you also discussed a session called by the proclamation of the governor. Was there any practical possibility that Governor Cooper was going to call the General Assembly back into session to enact voter ID legislation?
I have no idea what sort of deals could have been made between the legislative and executive branches, but it seems unlikely that that would have happened.
Okay, no further questions. Thank you.
Mr. Cox, do you have any questions?
No, thank you, Your Honor.
Any redirect, Ms. Klein?
Just one question, Your Honor. Ms. Ferris, in considering the standard legislative practices for what happens during regular sessions and extra sessions, is there any difference in why the general legislature would call a regular session versus an extra session, or what those sessions are used for?
Reconvened regular sessions are continuations of the session that starts at the beginning of the odd numbered years right after the election. And typically they're used to take up subjects that didn't get considered in the prior session, subjects that were under consideration but were not but had not come to a conclusion for lack of time or lack of information or other of those types of factors. So that's the difference. But the difference between the regular and extra session is that one is a continuation and one is a clean slate. It just wipes the deck, and you have to start over. You have to adopt new rules, make new committee assignments, just start over with that. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's the distinction.
Thank you. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
All right, are there any further questions for Ms. Ferris?
No, Your Honor.
No, Your Honor.
Ms. Ferris, thank you very much for your testimony. You're free to leave the virtual courtroom at this point. Ms. Riggs, are you ready to call the plaintiff's next witness?
Thank you, Your Honor. Yes, we are. And for this purpose, I will pass to my colleague Apeksha Vora to call our next witness.
Good morning, Your Honors. We haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, but my name is Apeksha Vora from the Paul Weiss firm on behalf of the plaintiffs. And if it pleases the court, the plaintiffs will now call Noah Reed.
Thank you. Can you spell your name for me?
Yes, my first name is A-P-E-K-S-H-A, and my last name is V as in Victor, O-R-A.
Okay. So you pronounce it just like you spell it then?
Yes, that's exactly right, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you for that. Just so I'm clear, who will be handling this witness, Noah Reed, for the legislative defendants and for the state defendants?
Your Honor, Mr. Huff, our co-counsel, will be handling this witness.
Is it?
I will, Your Honor. Paul Cox from the Attorney General's office for the state defendants.
Okay, is it Nathan Huff? Is that right?
Yes, it is, Your Honor.
Okay. Is Noah Reed present in the virtual courtroom?
Yes, he's been admitted.
I'm here.
Mr. Reed, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, sir.
Good afternoon. Or excuse me, it's not quite afternoon yet. Good morning.
Good morning.
Ms. Vora, you may begin your direct exam. Well, strike that. Mr. Reed, if you could please raise your right hand. Ms. Beal, are you prepared to swear in the witness?
Yes, sir.
You may proceed.
Do you solemnly affirm that your testimony to the court will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and this is your solemn affirmation?
I do.
Thank you. You can lower your hand.
Now, Ms. Vora, you may begin.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Reed, could you please state your name for the record?
Noah Wilson Reed.
And where do you live, Mr. Reed?
I live in Burlington, North Carolina, in Alamance County.
How long have you lived there?
20 years.
What do you do for a living?
Mason.
Do you hold any positions within the county?
I am on the Alamance County Board of Elections.
And how long have you served on the Alamance County Board of Elections?
This will be my 5th year.
So working backwards, when were you seated on the board?
I believe in 2017.
What are your responsibilities as a member of the board?
As a member of the board, we review the budget and make budget proposals with the assistance of the staff. We make decisions on early voting schedules, times, days. We help process provisional ballots. We are quasi judicial, so if there are elections challenges or candidate challenges or voter challenges, we rule on those. And we review provisional ballots, and around election time, we are there in the office with the staff to help administrate the elections should any unusual circumstances occur. We just handled the recount after the 2020 election.
Does your role as a board member involve speaking to voters?
It does.
And have you administered any elections while in your role as a member of the county board?
Yes, 2 federal elections, and this will be the 3rd municipal election this year.
How many offices does the County Board of Elections have in Alamance County?
We have 1 office.
Where is that one office located?
It is on a side street off of the courthouse square
In what town?
in Graham, North Carolina.
When is the County Board of Elections office open?
We're open business hours, 8 to 5,
And what days of the week is that?
Monday through Friday.
How many people work at the County Board office?
We have 5 or 6 employees, including our director, and around election time, we employ a few part-time employees, usually for technical matters, handling the voting equipment.
Let's talk a bit about Alamance County. What is the rough population size of the county?
About 160,000.
Is that a larger or a smaller county relative to other counties in North Carolina?
I would say it's medium size.
Has there been any change in the population over the last few years?
Yes, I think we are, especially for a county of our size, have a lot of growth. We are sort of a bedroom community for the larger populated counties to the east and west.
And where in the county has there been growth?
Predominantly in the eastern side.
Would you consider Alamance County more rural, urban, or somewhere in the middle?
It's a mix along the interstate corridor, along I-40. It's relatively urban. And then in the north and south of the county, there's a lot of agricultural land, pretty rural.
Let's talk a bit about the racial demographics as you understand them of the county. Would you consider Alamance County racially diverse?
Yes, I think it reflects sort of the general diversity of North Carolina. Probably 60% or so white, 25% or so African American, 10 or 15% Latino.
Where, if at all, within the county is the African American population concentrated?
North Burlington probably has the largest African American population. It is a city of about 55 to 60,000. The other municipalities in the county, Mebane, Graham, are probably 10 to 15,000. There are African American populations in those. We do have African American population in the more rural areas. The municipality of Green Level is Haw River sits on the town of Haw River sits relatively close to the interstate, and Green Level is African American. I think it's a majority African American town. Probably has about 25% Latino population as well, and it's probably 12 to 15 minutes from the interstate.
To your knowledge, is there public transportation in Alamance County?
There is. Probably 6 or 7 years ago, Burlington initiated a public transportation system. It was joined by Gibsonville, which is in the which is northwest of Burlington, and it was also joined. It was also it has connections to the Alamance Community College.
Does the public transportation system provide access to the county board's office from the areas in the county that you just mentioned where the African American population is more concentrated?
Burlington and Burlington and Gibsonville, those two towns put together probably or a little less than half of the population of the county. Green Level, for instance, which is in a more rural area, does not have public transportation. Ossipee and Altamaha, which are northern municipalities on the western side, likewise don't have public transportation.
So, speaking more broadly, do you have any concerns about the availability of public transportation to the county board office in Graham?
I'm glad we have what we have, but it is not within the municipalities that it serves. It is not. Could be more extensive. It is mainly along the busier roads. So I would welcome this expansion to other municipalities in the county.
Based on your experience as a board official and speaking to voters, what challenges do you see that voters have associated with accessing the board office?
Well, it is, as we were discussing, the public transportation issue is of concern. The town of Graham, has 10 to 15,000 people, so that's only about 10% of the county's population. It is near downtown Graham, but sort of on a smaller side street. My experience with people in the last election wanting to submit their absentee ballots in person at the Board of Elections, I've received quite a few questions just generally asking where it was. It's not in a it is not in a government complex or in a particularly well-known, particularly obvious place.
All right, I want to switch gears just a little bit. Are you familiar with a voter ID bill that was passed in 2018 by the North Carolina General Assembly?
I am.
If I refer to that today as SB 824, will you understand what I'm talking about?
I will.
And are you generally familiar with the requirement under that law for county boards to issue IDs to voters?
I am. Our board briefly issued IDs.
I was just going to ask that. Does the county board have machines to print IDs?
We had one machine. I think we still have it in storage.
Do you know how many IDs were issued by the Alamance County Board?
We issued IDs for a pretty short period of time. I would estimate probably less than 100.
Did you personally see people come into the office to request an ID?
Our board chair requested an ID, so I did not watch him get his ID, but I was aware. We are in the office only when it's not election time, only a day or two a month. So no, I did not see people actually getting IDs made.
Are you generally familiar with the types of people who are coming in to get IDs?
From what I was told, they were mostly people who were just curious about the ID process and wanted to see the machine. And, there were probably people who had other forms of ID, but who were just anxious to familiarize themselves with it.
I think you mentioned that Alamance County had one machine. When it was operating during this time, where was that machine located?
It was in the entrance lobby of our building.
Does a person have to manually operate the ID machine in order for the machine to print an ID?
Yes, I believe the Board of Elections employee would assist them with that process.
And how many members of the staff could use a single ID machine at a time?
I think it only makes one ID at a time, so one at a time.
One at a time. Do you know if there will be a staff member who is dedicated full-time to operating the ID machine at the Alamance County Board office?
For the brief time that we had it, basically you walk into the entry area and there's a desk with a glass in front of it, sort of like at a doctor's office. 2, maybe 3 of our staff have their desk right there, but nobody was dedicated to it. We have a voter registration person and a IT person that sit at that desk and sort of when the public comes to the office are there to help them, but not a dedicated person.
So how was the strike that? How will the board staff decide who would operate the ID machine if someone came in asking for an ID during that time period?
I imagine the staff that is most likely to be working there at the entrance lobby would be trained in that.
When would the board office be open to print voter IDs?
8 to 5, Monday through Friday.
Why did the board decide to put the ID machine at the county board office in Graham?
That would really be the only place to put it. We have one office, so that's where our staff is.
And based on your experience, do you feel like people know where the county board office is located?
as I said, my experience with recently with people wanting to submit absentee ballots, it was a pretty regular question I got was, where is the office?
Are there other locations within the county that you believe voters would find more easily?
Well, Burlington is 3 or 4 times bigger than Graham. So if you were, I'm just speculating here, but I would think that a larger populated area would provide greater service to the greatest number of people.
Do you have any reason to think that based on your experience administering elections or as a county board member?
Well, if you could look at early voting sites, the 2 most popular early voting sites are in Burlington and in Mebane. The Graham site would probably be the 3rd most popular. That's out of, on a presidential election year, for the first time this year, we had 5 sites. So.
And why did the board decide not to put, strike that. Could the board have put ID machines at those sites?
Well, those are early voting sites. So those are probably, we have part-time staff there that work, in a presidential election. They would be working early voting, but I would not, for the rest of the year, I would not think it practical to have a early voting site. A ID. We're just not, those are temporary sites.
Aside from the board office's location, are there any other administrative constraints associated with having one location to print IDs?
Could you repeat that question?
Sure. Aside from the board office's location, are there other administrative constraints associated with having just one location to print IDs?
I'm not sure.
What, if any, concerns do you have about the county board's ability to issue IDs?
Well, along with not, having limited facilities and limited staff is just, it would be, well, we tend to be pretty stretched on resources. So anything added to what we already do, we've had a request. Our county manager has requested a flat budget from us for the last, as long as I've been on the board. So for 4 or 5 years, and if I understand correctly, several years before that. So, I would just be concerned that it would take our resources away from other needs, such as, what the board often is looking for money for is these days is for expanding early voting.
Now, earlier in our conversation today, you mentioned that the county board reviews provisional ballots. Based on your experience, what is your understanding of the process for a voter to cast a provisional ballot?
Well, they would be at the polling location, and there would be a problem with their registration. I guess they could be at the wrong precinct, or they were an inactive voter, they might have had they might not be on the poll books. So they would hopefully be given the right advice from the poll worker and be suggested to vote provisional. They would go to another desk at the polling site where another poll worker would, it's like a packet, like a sealed packet that they would be given to open up with paperwork to fill out that they would describe what the problem was with their voting a normal ballot. Then the poll worker would, we encourage them to write a descriptive note as well, and that would all go into a security envelope. That security envelope would then be brought back to the board offices. At some point, staff would open those envelopes and review the reasons for the provisional vote. If there was research to be done, such as questions about their residency, that the staff would handle that. And then that research and those provisional ballots would be presented to the board for review to be voted on for the acceptance of the provisional ballots. That would happen after Election Day.
How long is the process, based on your understanding, from when the voter is initially, pulled out of line up until the vote is then sealed back in that envelope?
It would probably depend on how busy the polling site was. If most poll workers, at a larger early voting site when it wasn't busy, there's plenty of folks to split up the responsibilities. Smaller sites on a busy period, there are multiple things going on. You have curbside voting, and you have handling the equipment, and you have the log books. So there would not be a dedicated person for the provisional, but so it could be there could be some delay.
One thing that you said was, hopefully the voter would be given the right advice. What did you mean by that?
Recently, we've done our list maintenance, and one concern with list maintenance has been, to make sure that, we love our election workers. Some of them have a lot of experience over many years, but it is a seasonal work, and we're always, it's hard to fill those positions. So there are quite a few new people. And there's just, frankly, a lot of rules. Even it's one thing that I really have grown to understand as I have been on the board. It's more complicated than I would have thought. So one of the main issues would be, would the poll worker suggest to the voter to vote provisionally, and then would the voter then successfully fill out the provisional ballot? I think sometimes there can be hesitation by a voter when something unusual or basically their status as a voter is challenged. We get anecdotal reports from our poll workers about people, whether for time constraint or just, if it's for instance, it's a curbside voting, it's a little complicated to do a provisional ballot just because of logistics. So I would hope that everything would go smoothly, but there are several steps along the, they would have to fill out the provisional ballot completely and effectively, giving reasons And sometimes they're would be required to come back and bring evidence. Say, I don't know from experience with voter ID, but I know from experience with residency issues, to bring evidence of their residency to the Board of Elections to be used during canvass when we're reviewing provisionals.
Thank you, Mr. Reed. Your honors,
Can I add one thing?
Yes.
I also just am concerned that people who did not have IDs would know that there was any other options if they did not have an ID. Our ability to, one of our big challenges, especially given our resources, is just to educate the public. So I know from experience when the laws have changed from requiring an ID to not requiring an ID, it is confusing to the public, and many people don't keep up with the back and forth on that.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Reed. Your honors, I have no further questions at this time.
Mr. Huffman, you may cross-examine the witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Nathan Huff of the law firm Phelps Dunbar for the legislative defendants. It's a pleasure to be addressing the court, I think for the first time in this litigation. Mr. Reed, good afternoon. Thank you for your time, for your patience. I want to start with just a couple of basics about the Board of Elections. Your county board has a website, doesn't it?
It does.
And voters in your county, or really anywhere, can access that website and find information about the voting process, can't they?
If they have access to the internet, yes.
And there's a contact us page on your website, right?
Sure. Yes, I believe so.
And that lists the address of the County Board of Elections office, doesn't it?
Yes, you can find the address on the website.
It lists a phone number that voters can call if they have questions, right?
Yes.
And it's got an email address that voters can use to email in if they have a question, right?
It does.
You were testifying on direct. You mentioned, I think, a couple of times that you had received and answered questions from voters. Is that right?
Yes.
And so, as a member of the board, if a voter has a question and they approach you needing help or advice about the voting process, you're always happy to help them, aren't you?
I am, although I also am always happy to direct them to the staff who are oftentimes better able to answer the questions.
And so the staff is accessible to the voters of your county if they have questions about how or where to vote?
Sure, try to be. There's busier times and less busy times. It varies a little bit according to that, but yes.
And so if a voter calls the phone number on the county's website, they can get an actual person to talk to and have their question answered, right?
Almost all the time, yes. There are times, but we try very hard to be as responsive as possible.
You've kind of referenced a few times that there are times during your operations that are busier than others. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
So are there times in your experience where the pace and the load of the work on the county board is less?
When it's not directly around election time, yes, it's less.
Okay, so things are slower during that time.
Yes.
I want to talk to you a little bit about your background. Before you were sitting on the County Board of Elections, you were a member of the Alamance County NAACP. Is that correct?
That's true.
And you actually held a official position with that organization?
I held several positions, yes.
And one of them was political action chair, right?
That's true.
And that was a job that entailed following the recommendations of the state NAACP, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and that organization recommends against voter identification laws, doesn't it?
Yes. I do not currently hold any position in the organization. When I became a member of the Board of Elections after I'd become inactive. I'm still a member, but not I hold no position there now.
And during your time with and I know you're still a member of the NAACP, but during the time that you were actually an office holder with that organization, you actually participated in protests on occasion, did you not?
Yes.
And one of those was in 2015, right?
I would say yes, probably.
Okay, well, I'll help you out a little bit. In Winston-Salem, do you remember that
Yes.
one?
Yes.
Okay. And one of the things that you were protesting there was a voter ID requirement, correct?
Yes.
All right, let me switch back to to your time with the board. You're sitting here today in your personal capacity, right?
Yes. I do not
Okay,
speak for the board.
all right, and you don't speak for any of the other members of the board, do you?
I'm sorry. I didn't understand what you said. You're sitting here today in your personal capacity, right? Answer yes. Then I didn't hear the rest of it. Sorry.
I do not speak for the Board of Elections or for any other organization.
When you first started out in your direct examination, one of the things that you said was that you were seated on the Board of Elections in 2017. Do you recall testifying to that?
Yes.
You completed and submitted an affidavit in this case, didn't you?
Yes.
And that was in May of 2019?
Sounds correct.
You signed that affidavit, right?
I'm sure I did.
And in that affidavit, you were truthful, weren't you?
Yes.
And you recall that in one of the opening paragraphs, you stated that you were seated on the board in August of 2018. Does that sound more accurate to you than 2017?
Well, the board was appointed by the governor, but then maybe, I don't know for sure, but it was I would estimate maybe 6 months went by before we were actually seated, while the makeup of the Board of Elections was litigated. I believe they had attempted, well, they did. They expanded it to 4 members, and then they expanded it to 5 members. So there was, like I said, there was probably about 6 months there between when I was initially recommended by the county party to when I was actually sworn in.
Okay, so if I were to look at your affidavit where it says August of 2018, that's a date where you actually took office on the board, so to speak. Is that right?
That sounds a little late, just from remembering things like determining early voting schedules. But if that's what the affidavit says, I will, and I signed it. I assumed at that point I had the clearest understanding.
And you served from August of 2018 until the board was disbanded in December of 2018, right?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. And Mr. Reed, I have to apologize to you. I'm looking over at this affidavit and it's April. I've been saying August by mistake, but
Yeah,
April 2018. Does that sound better?
That sounds better, yes.
Okay.
Like I said, we had voted on things that would have been timely in April, but not in August.
Okay. So my apologies for throwing you for a loop there. So just to make sure that we're on the same page then. So April 2018, you serve until the board is disbanded in December 2018. Do I have that part right?
Sounds right.
Let me interject at this point, Mr. Huff. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt. It's now 12:30 and it's time for our lunch break. We will take about an hour and a half for lunch, come back at 2 p.m. I hope that you all have a good lunch and we'll see you then.